The Pilgrim Fathers take a handful of Puritan separatists, put them on a 2-month journey across the Atlantic after narrowly avoiding persecution, and add some good old-fashioned Indian grave robbing to get one of the seeds of American democracy. Truly, they were a complicated bunch of English colonists with an incomprehensible need for survival. Although often referred to as pilgrims, it was not the term used to describe them at the time. No, the pilgrims were actually a brand of separatist Puritans called Brownists, essentially even stricter Puritans, which is of itself an achievement. So how did these persecuted English sickly Christians become one of the standing stones of American culture? Well, to answer that, we have to go back to 1605 when they quit the Church of England in favour of a more independent belief of worship known as Brownism. In the main, this involved being allowed to worship when they wanted as opposed to when the church told them to, with more voluntary ones and a more democratic system. However, these beliefs angered the church under the Act of Uniformity, which made it literally illegal not to attend their official services, i.e. every Sunday and holy days. The punishment for these included fines and even imprisonment, with most of it being directly targeted at the pilgrims. This reached such a degree of imprisonment and execution that they ended up having to move from place to place, narrowly avoiding this oppression, with several of their leaders being slaughtered. The pilgrims went from Norfolk to Middelburg to Amsterdam before finally settling in the Netherlands Leiden in 1607. Now, for the most part, life in the Netherlands was a joy for the pilgrims. They were allowed to live without harassment and found good work in the university, as well as printing, textiles, and brewing. Also, Leiden was an industrial centre in Europe, meaning they were making an excellent income and could have lived them in peace and comfort within the city. So if that's the case, why did they decide to leave? Well, if you're living in a continental European country, then it's more than likely that you're going to get a bit friendly with the natives. That's right, the reason the pilgrims decided to leave their industrious life was because they were becoming too Dutch for their liking. They thought they would go extinct if they stayed. That, and they also thought the Dutch morals were a bit too libertine, and many of them were leaving Holland in general just in search of adventure. So yes, in other words, they wanted a place where they could live with only their religion, only their culture, and only their race, where they could have an easier life. Now, if part of that's sounding a bit somewhat supreme to you, then don't worry, it gets better. So the pilgrims had to find a place that could fit all of their needs, which, if we look at the possible states of the time, that runs up to about 0. So if you can't find a country like that, then what's to do for a party of 102? Well, wouldn't you know it, there just so happened to be a newly discovered continent ripe for colonization. America. Or more rather, the New World. So, just to get this cleared up, here is a brief history of the discovery of America. Okay, this pompous fool called Christopher Columbus thought the world was smaller and pear-shaped, so gets the King of Spain to give him money to sail to India across the Atlantic for the spice trade. So he does, and he hits land thinking he's found India, and the Indians killing natives, demanding gold, despite them not having any. Up and down the Caribbean, he did this multiple times, going back and forth with treasure, and then died thinking he had proved his theory and reached India. This was later found out to be America, proving all of his theories wrong. Necessarily, he wasn't even the first European to discover America, as Leif Erikson, an Icelandic explorer, had discovered it nearly a millennium earlier. Despite his failure, Columbus did make it possible for the New World to be explored and colonized. Now, back to the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims could have gone to the northeast coast of Africa, or closer to the English colonies, yet decided to settle nearer the Hudson River. This was so as not to upset the environment within the two countries. There were, however, concerns that the natives would be violent, yet it was a risk they were willing to take. So preparations were made to have the strongest young men set up the colony and supplies, where they were brought, and let's say a limited budget. Originally 2 ships were going to be used for the trip, the Speedwell, originally the Swiftsure, and the Mayflower. Now, the Speedwell was part of the fleet that repelled the Spanish Armada. However, it only managed to make the journey from the Netherlands to Southampton in Hampshire to pick up the Mayflower. Then, as they departed to begin the journey to America, the crew noticed that she was taking on water and diverted to Dartmouth, Devon, and then Plymouth. They later sold the Speedwell and converted to the Mayflower. With that, the Pilgrims departed on the 6th of September, 1620. Now, the first part of the journey went incredibly well, without any problems whatsoever. The wind was blowing in the correct direction, and the water was steady, and it stayed like this throughout the rest of the journey. Just kidding. They were hit by a storm midway through, the main beam cracked, and the captain considered just going back to Europe. Yes, at this point, they were halfway through the journey, a month in, and the people in charge were talking about heading back. The founders of white America, people. Regardless, the beam was soon replaced with a great iron screw. If you're wondering why on earth they would have something like that, it was apparently for building a cider press. And there were only 2 hiccups of a guy falling off but getting back on, and another guy dying before they got there. But don't worry, a baby was born on the ship, replacing them, and they named it Oceanus. That's nice. Finally, after tedious conditions, the Mayflower took sight of land at Cape Cod, and people rejoiced with the reading of Psalms 100, or in other words, the Thanksgiving prayer. Remember this. Now, since the Pilgrims didn't have any laws for their new land yet, some people actually had the nerve to suggest keeping it that way in some sort of religious anarchist state. Now, needless to say, that wasn't going to happen. And the men of the Mayflower came together and wrote what is considered one of the seeds of American democracy, the Mayflower Compact. Basically, it was a bundle of laws written for co-operations among the settlers for the good of the colony, unto which they promised all due submission and obedience. It also stated that issues would be divided by voting, which, in other words, is some good old democracy. Speaking of which, the first governor was appointed by the Fathers, a man named John Carver, being one of the most respected and the first to write his name on the compact. Now, if you're wondering why I'm drawing so much attention to this compact, the reason being is that it was so important since it was basically the world's first constitution. Yeah. Although they couldn't really explore the new lands for 2 weeks, since the boat to get to the land was damaged, they went out to collect firewoods on tiny little dinghies, and when they finally could go out, they found a European house with a kettle and newly cultivated cornfields. Along with that, they found an artificial mound, which, upon digging, they found to be an Indian grave, with maize in it. Now, who can guess what they decided to do upon discovering this? Did they A. take the corn, therefore grave robbing, or B, you already know it's going to be A, so there's no point in continuing this. Yes, the Pilgrims were grave robbers, something which they then repeated with another and more fresher grave, although they did leave some out of respect, and they then proceeded to steal more maize and beans from 2 tents mere minutes before the 2 Native Americans inside them ran away upon seeing them. They did, however, say they would pay them back if they ever met them again, but for now it was theirs. Because remember, kids, it's not stealing if you pay them back. Which, in all fairness, they did, 6 months later. Now, by December, the Pilgrims had become extremely sick. They were coughing violently, had the scurvy, not to mention the fact that half of them were already dead by the first winter. Yeah, the colony was not starting out well. And it was about to get worse with a group of vengeful natives. Now, the Pilgrims' first contact with the Indians came to when a group of 7 went on an exploration and found more mounds with acorns along with some graves. This time, they made the wise decision, for once, of not stealing from the graves of the people who had a hatred for white people. Speaking of which, they then heard native cries not far from the camp and were then attacked by the natives the next morning. Why, you asked? Because a year earlier, the Norsettes would frequently see the English coming around Cape Cod for fishing before the Mayflower arrived, and 20 of them were kidnapped by a guy called Thomas Hunt to be sold into slavery in Europe. Now ask yourself, if you were a person of Native American origins, and people who looked strikingly familiar to the ones who came and kidnapped 20 of your friends and family, what would your first instincts towards them be? The same as them? Yeah, that's what I thought. The men did fire back with guns, which of course scared them off. Another group of Indians also lived by, known as the Pokanoket, who, like honestly the majority of Native Americans, had a great hatred of the English, mostly because they captured several of them, brought them onto their ship, and shot them. I think I'm starting to see why. This would regularly happen, along with plague, it wiped them out. Except this one kid called Squanto who escaped to England. Remember him, he's important. Of course, at this point they still hadn't set up an actual settlement yet, and they were just heading along the east coast. But that wouldn't be a problem anymore, since guess what? The Mayflower's mast just broke and the rudder fell off, and now they're having to paddle to shore. This did lead to the founding of Clark's Island, and after somehow repairing the equipment, they made it to the shoreline to set up the actual, settlement. The place they chose was surprisingly well suited to their current situation, as not only had it been miraculously cleared for them before they arrived, but it was sheltered by high hills for the winter. Oh, by the way, the miraculous clearing was thanks to the Wampanoag. God, why do these Native American cultures have to have such complicated names? Okay, here goes. the Wampanoag. Yeah, I think that's right. The Wampanoag people who made a village there, but abandoned it 3 years earlier because of plague there. In fact, it was so bad that the Pilgrims found unburied skeletons in their houses, which they of course started building as soon as they got there. Now, since they really had to get moving, and they couldn't afford to be building houses for every single family, the men had to be distributed to live with other families. Every family was given a patch of land a rod wide and 3 rods long. And for those of you who speak English, about 5.5 yards and 16.5 yards long. They even had to build the houses themselves, and their first completed house was immediately converted into a hospital for the sick, with 31 already dead. With the deaths still rising, the first cemetery was built, with grass being allowed to grow over them, because they feared the Indians would see just how weak they actually were and raid them. At this point, only 47 of the Pilgrims were still actually alive. Oh, and remember that guy John Carver, the governor? Yeah, he's dead. Now this guy William Bradford is governor. At this point, you're probably wondering, God, when will these guys get a break? And this is taking forever. When is this going to end? Well, some may arguably say it ends with the colony consisting of Bristol, Plymouth, and Barnstable County. And for those like me who live in Devon, England, is anyone else noticing some name-taking? Not only did they occupy 3 counties, but they were growing in numbers, and they had a successful harvest. But they were now recognized as the Massachusetts Bay, making them a separate colony altogether, which is really where this should end. However, if that's so, why do I feel like I'm forgetting something? Oh, that's right, Thanksgiving. Remember the prayer they said on the ship when they got there? Yeah, that really stuck with them. And remember Squanto? Well, he was requested to come back to his homeland by another group of Indians, where he found the Pilgrims and taught them how to catch eels, plant corn, and he even translated them to the Wampanoag Indian. Thanks to Squanto, they had been able to make their first successful harvest. The 90 Wampanoag also set out and hunted for them, retrieving fowl, and most notably, of course, turkeys, and celebrated it, as well as mourning their dead by eating, playing games, and celebrating one god with the Indians. Of course, this wasn't actually called the Thanksgiving feast, and there's a lot of misconception about it, but it did show just how persistent the Pilgrims were, and how they made peace with the Indians and lived alongside them together, which remained with them for the rest of American history. Yeah! Until, of course, they started killing them, taking their land, and throwing them onto reservations. But that's all in the past now. But hey, at least it means Americans get to have turkey with all the trimmings and pumpkin pie once a year. Happy Thanksgiving, America, even if it is 1 month early.